Hey everybody, welcome once again to the Soldiers of Cinema podcast. We are at episode 23, where we'll be discussing Nosferatu the Vampyre, Herzog's 1979 film. And, as always, with me today is Mr. Cullen McFader. What's up, dude?
Hello.
How you
I'm
doing?
good.
Yeah.
Everything's very cold here, but
yeah, what are we sitting at up there, temperature-wise? Oh, we've got to do the Celsius to Fahrenheit thing again.
Let's see. Let's see what it is today. -6 Celsius today.
Whoa. So, okay. Well, so I know it's like in the 20s or something, right?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I haven't been outside yet today. I know it's kind of sad. It's 1:00 p.m. here today, and I've yet to be outside. But here we're sitting at a super comfortable 63 degrees. So
nice. I'd prefer that. Certainly.
Quite a bit of difference. Well, maybe we could trade because I kind of miss winter. I grew up in the Midwest where we have winters. I guess that's easy to say though when you don't have to deal with it. I don't miss going outside and having my car door locks frozen shut, or things like that. I definitely don't miss that. So anyway, but yeah, like I said, we're here to discuss Herzog's. I definitely consider this a masterpiece. I think many people would consider this to be one of Herzog's masterpieces, one of his greater works. Nosferatu the Vampyre from 1979.
My personal favorite of his movies.
Okay, excellent. And it's one of my favorites, and I think that it's the most beautiful film visually that he's ever made. And he's made some really beautiful films, but I think this film is just extraordinary. And so to give a little context to this, this film, it's not a remake, but I think it would be fair to say that this is an homage to Murnau's 1922 film, Nosferatu. And in listening to Herzog speak about this film, it's very clear that this is an extremely important film. I would say it's likely that this is one of the most important films for him as a filmmaker. And I've even heard him say that it wasn't until this film, and it's not that he hadn't made many films before this. I don't know how many films he'd made before this, but it's a lot. What I don't even know. I don't want to say I'd be wrong, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's a couple dozen films he'd made before this one, up until this point. But I've heard him say that he didn't kind of know where he was as a filmmaker before this film, and that after he made this film, he knew where he had been, he knew where he was, and he knew where he was going as a filmmaker. So, and I know it's an extremely important this connection that he had with Murnau's film. And to give a little context, I've heard Herzog speak to the fact that growing up in Germany and Bavaria and coming into film as a young adult, that he felt felt orphaned, that the entire generation of filmmakers directly before him were non-existent in Germany because of World War II for various reasons. Either they had been employed willfully or unwillfully into the Nazi machine, or they had fled the country, or any number of things. But that he felt like there was not any father figure, so to speak, in film, and that he had to jump over that divide and go back even another generation. And so this film was one that was particularly impactful to Herzog. For that reason, he felt like it was a way to connect himself to his filmmaking ancestors, if you will, in Germany. Also, he felt that the German culture and German film had been devastated by World War II and frankly by Nazis, and that had devastated the reputation, and that their culture didn't feel valid anymore. And he wanted to go back to this time where German filmmaking and German culture meant something, and he wanted to create a connection to that and bring that back, that validity, that legitimacy of culture and film back to Germany. So really, really an important film for him. I think he felt a lot was on this, and it meant a lot to him, and to the point where I think we're all familiar, or many of you are familiar, when he was a young filmmaker, Lottie Eisner was a really important figure to him. I think she was a German film critic, if I'm not mistaken, or wrote quite a bit about German film, and knew personally all of the Fritz Lang and Murnau and other important expressionism German filmmakers. And he even invited her. She actually came to the set and was there for part of this, and that was very important. That's Actually, that's the person that he walked. I think was it 1,000 kilometers? He walked to quote unquote keep her alive. He's like, she was on her deathbed apparently, and he said, "No, you're not dying. I'm gonna walk. I'm gonna walk to you, and you're gonna stay alive because you know that I'm walking 1,000 kilometers to meet you, so you can't die." So clearly a very important film for Herzog. And to give even a little more context, as I just go on and on here, Cullen, thank you for being so patient while I just blab away. But of course, Murnau's film in 22 was an illegal, if you will, remake of Bram Stoker's Dracula. He changed the names of all the characters, but was actually still successfully sued. Mm-hmm. And as part of that losing that lawsuit, he actually, almost every every print of this film was destroyed. And it's actually practically a miracle that we have this film at all anymore. Only a few, thank goodness, only a few prints survived. And so that we were able to, restorers were able to piece together a complete print. And now, thankfully, in the digital age, you have ready access to it from anywhere. But I think that context is extremely important to understand. And, Herzog says himself, and I agree, I'm so removed from what that might feel like. He's like, unless you're German, it's very difficult to comprehend what that felt like to feel so orphaned, to not have any of the previous generation of filmmakers be there to mentor you or to inspire you. This total void that existed. And so I think this was his way to kind of bridge that gap and to feel connected to his culture and ancestors. And
the German film industry is, to me, one of the most interesting, both because of the movies that have been made throughout its history, but also because of the context in which they were made. I wrote a paper in high school, like in my grade 12 history class when I was back in high school, on specifically the effects of World War I. But what's so interesting about the German industry is, so you have World War I end, and you have all these movies being made in Germany, despite the fact that there are power outages and these power outages led them to paint, shadows on sets and use these huge shadows, and everything was dark and high contrast because they couldn't power the lights. Yeah. So that's where this German expressionism comes from. And so you have a decade of that, of economic turmoil, and them struggling to make movies through, with no money and no power. And succeeding, brilliantly. And then you have the decade of, prior to World War I, of the Nazi rise, where, people are being killed and imprisoned and stuff for speaking out against the regime. And then, of course, you have World War II, where, you've got even more people being killed, of course, and this a huge clampdown on any dissenting voices, right? Even just artists in general. You didn't even have to be a dissenting. You just had to make art that wasn't necessarily approved by the regime. Right. And then you go post World War II, and you get into the Cold War, where the country's split in half. Which actually does apply slightly to this movie. We were talking about this a bit earlier, but the cinematographer was arrested for trying to smuggle his girlfriend across. So you've got this massive Berlin history Wall. Of, potentially the most, put under pressure country for film in history.
In a lot of ways,
there's never been, until very recently, until like the past 2 decades maybe, there's never really been a stable period of filmmaking in Germany, which I think is so, and it's remarkable that you have all these German movies that came out of those like tumultuous times that are still brilliant. Herzog being one of the masters of there, but you get Wim Wenders, who was also part of that German New Wave, and then you have movies like Nosferatu, which show that like there was this perseverance for German filmmakers, kind of in spite of all that the hardships. They still made these masterpieces, and perhaps because of the hardships, they made these masterpieces, and they, that as they say, like only the strong survive. Perhaps it was this like need.
I feel like you should have said that in Herzog's voice.
But perhaps there was this need to overcome those odds.
And
so that these filmmakers kind of knew that they had to make something truly amazing, and they had to really, pull out all the stops to create these masterpieces.
It's an extremely rich, and I didn't know some of these things prior to preparing for this podcast. And I think, yes, it's extremely vital to understand. I mean, look, every work of art's culture and history is vital to, to fully understanding it. Of course, you can appreciate the film on its own without knowing any of these things.
Absolutely.
Of course. Yeah. But I think as you kind of dig deeper, you do enrich in your understanding for sure. And so maybe this is a good place we can talk about some of the comparisons to Murnau's film. They were made, almost 60 years apart.
Yeah.
So filmmaking had changed quite a bit. And a couple immediate differences that you can see is that, of course, Herzog's film is sound and is filmed in color. So he decided to go color as opposed to black and white. So those are two significant technical differences right off the bat. The medium had progressed technologically quite a bit in those almost 60 years. But there's some other really interesting changes too. Although, I think from a plot perspective, the vast majority of the plot is pretty much point for point.
There are some slight differences, and then of course the ending is kind of
the ending is significantly different, right?
But perhaps that's Herzog commenting on it as well.
Could be
kind of his cynical kind of take on the ending.
Maybe so, yeah. Because in Murnau's film we have that Lucy does, and I'll just refer to these characters in the names that they had here in Herzog's film, but Lucy sacrifices herself to kill Count Dracula. And in Herzog's film, he has his name again because we didn't have those copyright issues.
Yeah, he's Count Orlok in 22.
Correct, right. So Herzog goes back to Count Dracula. Although it's interesting, some people do think that his name is Nosferatu.
Yeah.
But it seems to be the origin of that word is maybe an ancient Romanian word for vampire, roughly translated, kind of. But she sacrifices herself. And Count Dracula is killed. He's kept past the sun rising. And then we have her husband, Jonathan Harker, just in the original film, he's alive and he's mourning her loss. But in Herzog's remake, a much more cynical ending, if you will, Lucy still dies, sacrifices herself. Count Dracula is killed by the sun, but we have Jonathan Harker being turned into a vampire. And in a really beautiful scene here at the end, we've got him, commanding his servant to, get his horse. He's got much work to do, and he flies off on his horse. And
my favorite shot in the whole movie is that
so
shot
beautiful.
of him riding off. And of course, he's changed into the dark cape instead of his yellowish one. Yeah.
And it's an interesting little, I guess you could call it a special effect scene there, that shot. But we've got this really beautiful, it's not even dunes. It's like a sandy plain. It's perfectly flat. Windy. And you've got this sand coming across and these beautiful waves. And then it's a double exposure where he's got the clouds from a storm, I think he said it was, flipped upside down and then run at high speed.
Yeah,
so it's a very unique,
looks brilliant
shot.
It's a really great shot.
Yeah. It really is beautiful, and there are so many good shots, and we're gonna get to that some more. But I think for me at least, the only other difference that really stood out to me was how different Count Dracula is in Herzog's film as opposed to Murnau's film in 22. I think in Murnau's film, to me at least, it seems that the Count Orlok in that film is much less complex of a character. He's kind of just this embodiment of evil, maybe even like insect-like, or we don't really get any kind of sense of complexity for him. But Kinski's Count Dracula, I mean, we really get a sense of his suffering.
It's more tragic.
It's much more tragic. Where he's in suffering. He's in isolation. He can't die, and he talks about this like the profoundness of 1,000 nights. I can't ever die. There's no release from this suffering. And it's through Lucy that he sees this purity, that he feels
salvation,
that he can be at the very least released from this suffering, and maybe even achieve some kind of salvation. So you get a sense of longing and suffering, human qualities in Herzog's Count Dracula, as opposed to this kind of just evil of Murnau's
this pure
Dracula.
Embodiment. Yeah.
So
and it's interesting too, because you can even get it right down to the moment where the locket is seen with Lucy's photo, and it's just it's the same idea, but the difference in the subtext is there. It's a much more of a longing, of a passion for the Kinski version than it is for this bloodlust that seems to kind of overtake the Max Schreck Count Orlok.
And not to say, I mean, Shrek, his Count Dracula Orlok was just, the physicality was such a powerful template that Kinski almost copies that verbatim, frankly, here. The physicality is just in both performances is outstanding, but I think Kinski does bring this tragedy, this like profound suffering.
There's just a depth to it.
There's just a greater depth.
There's a. It's not, and I don't want to say it's one dimensional in the 22 movie, because I love the 22 movie. I think it's incredible.
And sometimes it's okay to be one dimensional too. Yeah. Let's just say that's not it's automatically.
Much more, I mean, again, it's also you take the period it was made in. Movies weren't necessarily enriched with depth and character study and things like that then, as much as they are with especially post 60s, that kind of new wave. Examination of characters and tropes and cliches and things like that you got with the 60s and 70s. So Herzog is definitely riding on that that style of like, let's take this story and let's actually bring it further and kind of bring it to the next step and examine it a little bit more. Which
is why I would never call this a remake. It's an homage, but I think it goes so much further.
And of course, I mean, this is just an aside. There's a new one being made by Robert Eggers, which I'd be curious to know if that one's going to be more of a remake.
Not to digress too much, but has it? This has been like kind of in production, out of production, kind of in turnaround or something for a while, right?
It's been in pre-production for a while, and it was just announced right after he did The Lighthouse that it was like full.
Oh, so not that long.
It was greenlit and all that. Yeah,
I will have to look into that more. I mean, I certainly would.
Yeah, I know nothing about it, so I don't want to talk too much on it, but
sure.
But it's just interesting it'll be interesting when that comes out to see, is that one going to kind of add even more subtext, or is it going to try and be more of an homage to the Herzog? Is it going to be an homage to the original?
Where will it go? Yeah. Well, I think, look, if nothing else, it's interesting to see that there's clearly there is still this interest in this kind of story, in this character, and so the fact that they're making another film, and again, look, we don't want to get too carried away with kind of remakes and sequels and things. Sometimes I think in this case, with these two films that we're discussing here, it's not a remake, and both films contribute substantially to film. Sometimes, of course, we get carried away, especially here in Hollywood, with remake after remake and recycling of the same old stories. But I will be excited to see what this new Nosferatu might turn into. But to go back to Herzog's film, some of the similarity as well. I mean, some of these shots are almost, it's the exact same shots. Some of, in some places, Herzog has replicated almost to a T Murnau's film. And other places, he does make some significant differences, like we've talked about. But this is certainly, there's no question that you could say that this is Herzog's film. And one of the things that I just we both talked about how we thought this was one of his more beautiful films, and I'd love to talk with you for a little bit about that, because although certainly he takes aspects of the cinematography of Murnau's film, and we definitely have a lot of this expressionism, this the high contrast lighting, low angles, canted angles, a lot of shadows. We even have some really interesting usage of unmotivated light and kind of surreal shots and that are just beautiful, and you can see very clearly that this is an homage. But he also does a lot of different things, his exteriors, his landscape shots. There's some really amazing work here.
I think there's this stark contrast between two styles in the movie that work incredibly well together. You've got this like, and Herzog is to me one of the masters of handheld photography, because I find that handheld photography, when it's not accurate and when it's not precise, doesn't work. Herzog's is always really precise. Herzog always knows what he's doing with his handheld.
And there's a lot of it in this film.
Incredible.
There's a lot of handheld in this film. Yeah.
But it contrasts with, and this was something that we just kind of noticed recently when I was watching Herzog's without sound, is that there's also moments in Herzog's that look like a silent picture. And one of those moments is when Nosferatu, or when Dracula is bringing his coffin off of the boat to find his new home, basically, and he's going through this graveyard and he winds up in this church. And if you watch that without sound, Kinski's performance is almost vaudevillian. He's exaggerated his facial expressions, and he
silent film
basks at some light at some point, and it's like it looks like a silent film. But interestingly, you mentioned that Herzog. This was brought up to Herzog by in the commentary, and
by his interviewer,
that he had no intention to do that, and he had no idea that it even came across that way. Which is
really, and didn't even know if he agreed necessarily with the observation. But I would agree with you. I think that in a lot of the performance, in a lot of the way it's shot. This certainly could, if you turn the sound off, I don't know that you would miss a tremendous amount about the story here. I think it would work quite well as a silent film.
Well, that's what's interesting, because the reason I turned the sound off was because I was just looking at these shots while we were talking, and I noticed that I didn't pause it. Like, I just kept it going, because I was like, even during the dialogue sequences where, you should be, of course, listening, it works in silence. And I actually am curious now, once we're done this, I might actually go back and watch the whole movie just without any sound, because I think that it provides such an interesting, what was interesting to me about it was that it was something that, I always thought this movie was beautiful. I think it's my favorite of Herzog's movies, both visually and just in general. I just love it. But looking at it without the sound, it just offered an entirely new perspective for me of just looking at where, and perhaps, it could have even been choices that Kinski was making to kind of pull from that silent era. But there's also one of the things that we kind of both pointed out was there's really long takes too. There's a lot of takes that to me also again harken back to, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that silent movie era where it's like somebody moving through a space, the camera's locked down on a tripod, and you're just panning with them and following.
Character enters, does their business, character exits, and show the entirety of it. There is a lot there. And it's interesting that you mentioned that there is a lot of this, especially when it comes to travel, as we have, Jonathan Harker, Bruno Gahn's character. He's traveling from his home to Transylvania, and Herzog even talks. There's a lot of long takes of travel of this character kind of moving through the frame very deliberately, and Herzog even mentions in his commentary how 21st Century, who didn't produce the film, like some people think, but distributed it in the U.S. only, tried to get him to take these things out. And they said, look, geez, we get the idea. He's like traveling. We don't have to have 5 minutes of him traveling, And Herzog was like, no. That's the point. That is the point. And of course, we've discussed this many times here in this podcast, how important it is for Herzog, this traveling on foot. And it's interesting to note, we didn't mention it a moment ago when we were kind of comparing and contrasting, but that is actually a substantial difference from the original film.
Yeah, because in the original, he takes the carriage and then switches carriages to Count Orlok's servant that comes by, which is honestly, in the original movie, one of the, to me, creepiest moments, how the carriage moves, because it's kind of fast motion and there's this really creepy horse thing. So but of course, as you were mentioning, in Herzog's, he does it on foot. He gets to
and it doesn't seem
Dracula's castle on foot.
And if you didn't understand, if you didn't have the context of what that means to Herzog, you might not find that to be any kind of significance, in that change to be of any significance. But I think it very much is for Herzog. And we see this transition of landscape, that he's kind of going almost through this wasteland, right? These dangerous types of landscapes, that, narrow ledge, on the side of that, rocky cliff with the water,
with the river running by,
right, and these really precarious feeling hills with the rocks, the large boulders, and the white water moving quickly, and we know that Herzog is always trying to find a landscape that represents, that's a landscape of the soul. And so I think it's much more important in this film and much more conscientious than maybe the travel part was.
Oh God, it's
for
beautiful.
Murnau.
There's the moment when he's climbing that mount, the really wet rocks next to the waterfall that's coming down, and it's up, and just watching him climb for probably a minute. Like it's probably not even cut for a minute, and it's beautiful.
And never be in a modern film. You'd never have that in a modern film, ever.
Which
ever.
To me is unfortunate. Herzog is so good, especially in this movie, and in I think all of his movies, but of just taking time and letting atmosphere. And I know, I've had this conversation, especially working on features, where people just want, a note that people often give is just like, okay, get to it.
Right.
Okay, let's
Yeah,
go,
yeah,
let's
yeah.
go.
All the time.
And I'm like, but one thing I find so appealing about a lot of modern, or, the few modern directors that still do this, is that atmosphere matters a ton. And I think Herzog really understands that. And there's a few directors working today that really understand that, about like, you can sit on things. A huge part of this movie is allowing yourself to sit and just take in the atmosphere. And it's something that the 22 film does differently than Dracula, actually. And there's sort of a compare and contrast with the original Dracula film that the 22 film was pulling from, is that Dracula really brushes by the castle sequence.
Yeah.
Dracula, I don't remember the characters' names in Dracula, but the guy gets to the castle.
Yeah.
The castle sequence is pretty short. He's bitten, and then he returns with Dracula to London.
Right. It's just a plot device.
Yeah.
It's not really for anything else. Yeah.
Huge aspect of both the 22 version and the Herzog version are how long is spent at the. It's like half of the movie they're at the castle.
Well, it's a good chunk. It's a good chunk of time, and we really see. And there's, and speaking of that, you remind me in Herzog's film of, we talk about these long takes, and it's whether they're, Dracula and Harker at the dining room table that first night, and he cuts his thumb, right? This famous scene where Kinski is compelled to compelled by the sight of blood, the smell of blood, and he tries to keep himself from it, but he can't, and he throws himself on to Jonathan's hand and sucks the blood from his finger. But this take goes on, and we move from the dining room table through this, to the fireplace, and there's another scene where a bit later, and Jonathan's trying to find his way out of the castle, and he checks half a dozen doors. In any other film, or in most films, you would have just cut, insert, cut, boom, boom, boom. He's trying these doors, and here we just, it's all in one. We're following him, and Herzog speaks to the importance for him of maintaining a spatial continuity.
Yes.
Never wanting the audience to not understand where things are spatially. And so he prefers often to shoot in these long takes.
Just to get the audience to learn, yeah.
Just to, and for me too, I generally prefer that. I think if you talk to many actors, they will prefer working in that manner. I think a lot, especially when you talk about action scenes in today's modern films, I sometimes feel like things are cut just too much. They're just, we lose a spatial orientation, and we don't believe anything that's in front of us, because we know that every time something happens, there's a cut to some other, some insert, or cut to some other take, or cut to something, and they don't often mesh perfectly well. And even if you can't articulate it consciously, you kind of know something's off, angles aren't matching, it's like, and I think we see this so much in film now. And let's face it too, it's a lot cheaper generally to shoot that way, apples to apples, right? It's a lot harder to shoot a 2-minute take.
Well, it's also interesting that what's actually very relevant about this movie to me right now is
the plague.
The plague, that, yes. But no, the feature that I'm working on right now, there's a specific moment when Kinski is entering Jonathan Harker's room in the castle, and he's like got his hands splayed out and stretched out, and he's almost floating into the room, and it's a terrifying image. It's probably, to me, the most bone-chilling image in the whole movie, or at least one of them. And he's just floating in the room, and it's this long take where Harker gets up fast. He pulls back and looks at him,
flies back to the corner of the bed.
But Kinski's just floating, and I don't know how they did it. Either they had him on a string, or if they had him on some sort of track or something, because he's floating without moving anything.
It's hard to say. It could have even been his physicality. It might have created that illusion. Yeah.
But I actually, in doing the feature that I'm working on right now, I was saying to the team that we're doing it with, that I sort of said, there's a moment in it where I specifically showed them that moment, because I was like, this is exactly how I want it to be. It's so different. Normally you'd get a vampire movie, you'd think of a vampire creeping in, and he's crawling around or something like that, and all creepy. But no, there's this stillness to Kinski's portrayal and to Herzog's direction that I think really work. And then, which again, when suddenly, Kinski is tossing the chair away, and you've got this visceral handheld camera work, contrasts so much and makes those moments so much more impactful, because you're going, holy, like, okay, this is, now he's angry.
Yeah.
So it's,
And there's a lot of that
a ton of really interesting
internalization
stuff. Yeah.
I think, in these performances. There's a lot of, I think there's some really beautiful moments where you've got, whether it's Lucy alone or it's Lucy and Jonathan together, several instances at the beach where you have these tender emotional moments, but Herzog chooses to shoot from behind, and often from quite a distance.
Yeah.
And I think, a lot of times what you'd have there is you'd have the camera right in their face, and you'd want to really, hit it on the nose. I want to see the waterworks, or, we want
the sweat running down his face.
And so I think there's often that's kind of the direction that people go, but I very much appreciate this understated manner with which he's shooting these moments, because it really does allow us as an audience to be more involved, to use our imagination. And, I also think that it does a fantastic job, and it's appropriate in this film, of highlighting, the isolation that these characters are experiencing.
Yeah.
And it's a fantastic way, I think, to kind of introduce the suspense or the foreboding.
And again,
that
intentionally or unintentionally.
Yeah.
And intentionally or unintentionally feels very German expressionist.
Yeah.
Like it totally, again, and I'll take Herzog at his word to say that he didn't intend that, because, there's no reason to lie about that. But I think that it's just so interesting, and perhaps it was just this subconscious thing of just like understanding the context of which this movie takes place, and the style and the atmosphere that you need to convey, that you almost need to pull from those conventions of like silent movies.
Well, and I think a lot of the way he shot this film is the way that he's made films before this quite a bit, right?
Yeah.
I think it's just kind of part of the fabric of who he is as a filmmaker.
Which makes sense about this whole orphaned filmmaker thing too, that he would then pull from. Which is really interesting.
Because I really don't see, there's some differences. And, Herzog has made a very wide range of styles and types of films and different subjects. But I have no problem believing that this is a Herzog film.
Yes.
It's not like this film somehow is so different than all the rest in too many ways for me to know that this is Herzog. And so I really feel like it's just a natural extension of who he is as a filmmaker.
Which arguably is the most interesting way to, whether you want to call it a homage or a remake or whatever, but it's the most, like, that to me is when I get interested in movies that are being remade or retold, is that, so often people remake movies or try and retell the same stories and try and push the original director's style onto it, or kind of keep that going. Whereas I find the opposite. I find that if it's a director who's retelling the same story or doing an homage to an older movie, that if they put their own fingerprints all over it, it makes it 10 times more interesting, because you get to see how would Herzog have directed Nosferatu, which obviously we have, because he did. But, to me, that's more interesting than if Herzog was just, spent the entire time trying to mimic the shots and the style of the original,
like Psycho.
But I just think that it's really interesting. Yeah, exactly, like Psycho. But I just think that it's really neat that you can really see his roots in this, and you can see where those styles came from and how he like. And I think it's really interesting that you mentioned the idea of that orphaned. That he was like, he says he was a kind of like an orphan generation of filmmakers.
Yeah.
Because you can really see, okay, in the United States, a filmmaker Herzog's age would have grown up perhaps a little bit younger than her, or much younger than Hitchcock, and kind of been inspired by those people who were working contemporarily in the 40s and 50s. Herzog is, working from the 20s and 10s.
Yeah.
Which is really, really interesting.
And of course, you tie this all in with the fact that, he hadn't seen film until he was, I think, 17, he said. And so, this definitely has an impact. And I think we see a lot of his kind of, some more of his personal touches that come across to me. We've got, we start the film with this long shot of the cats and the pendant. And that always makes me think Herzog. I think every film, almost every film that he's made has some kind of, he lingers on some animal for some period of time.
And lots of bats in this.
And lots of bats. And it's interesting, the slow motion shots of the bats here, he actually took from a scientific film. I think we're looking at, he didn't quite know, so he kind of gave a range of 500 to 800 frames per second of these scientific films that were kind of studying the wing movement of bats, and so he grabbed that, put it into the film, but it works fantastically. we've got these really interesting kind of tableau shots of one that really stands out in my mind, and it's very surreal, and I guess you could call it unnatural in a sense, or unrealistic, but it works perfect here, is that of Renfeld in prison with the two guards, one on each side, and they're practically staring right at the camera. And there are a handful of shots in Murnau's 22 film that are very similar to this. It's almost kind of like a still photography type of shooting, if you will, right? Where we had these tableaus in photography in the early era, in the early beginnings of photography, where people had to sit for sometimes minutes to get an exposure. And I almost get a sense that there's some of the shots in Herzog's films going back that far, and you look how just they're very it's just kind of unnerving, and kind of gives you this sense of just surrealness, which I think works perfect here. But huge sense of
surrealism, which also really ties into the use of music.
Yeah, well, and of course,
Herzog,
he uses one of his common collaborators here, absolutely. And
of course, it opens with this choral, very deep kind of choral and strings mixed over the shots of the mummified bodies, which were real.
Which is which Herzog shot in
Guatemala,
Mexico.
I think.
He shot that in Mexico, and I think it's kind of the story here is that he was in the States for. On some type of scholarship or sponsorship or something, and for whatever reason, he decided he didn't want to perform the duties that he needed to do to keep that current. So he escaped to Mexico because the way he tells it, he was going to be sent back to Germany. So he runs to Mexico to escape the authorities here in the U.S. And while there, he came across this area where, as sort of the story goes, there was a cemetery, I guess, where you had to pay for the plots indefinitely. So as long as the body was there, you'd have to pay rent, basically.
Yeah.
And so eventually, some people would stop paying rent for whatever reason. Maybe they were finally dead, right? But anyway, and so they would dig these bodies up, and just because of the nature of the climate and soil there, they would be mummified. And so over time, people started to come to see these mummified bodies, and then it kind of grew into like a museum. So they had these mummified bodies on display in glass cases. And when Herzog saw that, he was completely mesmerized. And so he convinced them to let him take the bodies out of the cases and line them up against this wall. And he shot them. And I mean, talk about effective, because look, you can tell that's real. I mean,
it's very unnerving. Yeah.
It's like all the special effects in the world. And I don't even know if still to this day, if you're going to make a more convincing scene than what we have here.
Unsettling moment.
I know. And because they're still wearing clothes, like some of those bodies are in boots, and Herzog says when he picked them up to lift them to place them on the wall, they might have weighed 15 pounds
because they're so brittle.
They're just so brittle and dry, but extremely interesting. Yeah.
And so we get that opening with that beautiful choral and strings music, which actually is really I love the moment in that music, which he uses again and again through the movie, where it goes from choral and then you have that high strings come in. I think it's a really beautiful piece.
Yeah.
And then it goes to, when he's traveling and kind of opening, there's this like almost very 70s kind of folk guitar almost.
Yeah.
That like plays as he's, and again, it's like, it kind of is jarring at first, because you're going from, this 16th century or whatever decade or era it takes place in.
Yeah.
This very old, of course.
Well, so the film takes place in roughly, I think you probably the mid 1800s. The mid 1800s is where we've got the film placed, right?
Yeah. But you go from that, in which, of course, you don't really think of like this like strumming guitar.
Sure.
But it works. It definitely works for the travel scenes and stuff like that. And then, the third kind of piece that really stands out to me is, of course, his use of Wagner, which is the prelude to the entry of the gods into the Valhalla from the Rheingold, Das Rheingold. And of course that to me, I can understand why he chose that. And I believe he's used that in other movies as well. But for this, it really works because it's about, that whole piece. It's like, it's about ascension, and it's about, just like rebirth and all this stuff. And so he uses that both on Count Dracula's journey to the town or the city, but also he uses it at the end when the town has kind of been decimated by this plague, and it's such an effective piece of music
Right.
I always like that piece too, because back in, I think, high school, I was making a short film and I used that piece in it without even having known that Herzog was a huge fan of it, and also Malick uses it sometimes. Great piece of music.
Yeah.
But it's super effective here. And so what I really like about that, and it's kind of a lot to my own taste, is that the music doesn't, a lot of directors are very, very particular about using music that all sounds like it fits within the same kind of genre,
right,
or mood or style.
Or
Herzog kind of just throws that against the window, or out the window, and doesn't really care. And I like that a lot, because it really affects the scenes that are happening. That, again, that guitar music kind of puts you at ease as what's his name? Harker is going to the castle. It kind of puts you at ease as he is, because he's kind of like laissez-faire about it, and he's sort of going along saying like, I'll be fine,
he doesn't know yet what's in store for him. Right.
And so you get this guitar music and you sort of feel this calmness, but then you arrive at the castle and that's all stripped away, and it becomes very, again, raw and visceral. I don't think there's, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think there's really much music used in the castle. I think most of that is just
there are periods for sure.
Yeah,
there's periods for sure where there's not a lot of music going on. I absolutely,
and it's just kind of atmosphere and creaks and
we do have that. We have some really interesting sound effects. And in reading Herzog's treatment, we haven't talked a lot about this, but the treatment, not the script, but the treatment for this film, about 130 pages long, is available online. And it's very interesting to see how Herzog writes. He doesn't write in a script format. It's very much a prose format, and there's none of this, camera direction or anything else. Dialogue is separated, but barely, not anywhere near like a screenwriting format. But that's specifically called out. We hear the wolves outside. The sounds are very much integrated directly.
The children of the night.
Yeah. Right. It's very much integrated. And, there is a lot of I listened to the soundtrack last night, and Popova, Florian Frick did the soundtrack, and Florian Frick has done the soundtrack, the music for many of Herzog's films. I don't even want to venture a guess to the number. I'd probably be wrong, but many of them, right? And there's a lot of this, and it, like you were saying, it's very interesting. We move from, an acoustic guitar, and it's almost kind of the 70s vibe, to sitars and this droning kind of hypnotic music. There's a lot of really interesting stuff there, and music that you just wouldn't immediately correlate with a horror film or at all.
I also want to add that this movie to me feels very timeless. Like, it doesn't, nothing in it feels 1979. It feels like it could be made in any decade and would be the same and would work the same. And I think a lot of that is about just Herzog's masterful direction. I think the fact that he directs in a way that is him and doesn't really adhere to styles of the time.
I think that's a great point. And, Herzog has never been somebody to jump on fads to hop on trends. I mean, that, you can say, you like them, you don't like them, this, that, the other thing, but it'd be really hard to argue that for anybody to take the stance that Herzog is like somebody else. And, I mean, he's definitely his own filmmaker. And I think many of his films have that feeling to me. Where and I think Herzog is just such a unique dude, to get at technical terms there. I think he's such a unique dude that it's just that his work just kind of, stands on its own, and it's just not trendy, I guess is the best way I could say it. His films aren't trendy, and so they don't evaporate with the passing years like a lot of other films might, And
you said that he hadn't even seen most versions of Dracula on film before.
I don't know that he had he seen any others. I'm not sure that he had seen any other aside from the 22, Nosferatu from 22. I don't know that he had. I feel like it's possible that he said he hadn't, or that he had seen other films. At least when he did the commentary. There is one specific memory I have where he had actually. Of course, this is after he made his film, but he had seen Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Okay, yeah. And, which is the 90s.
And he didn't like it at all. because he felt like it was too he felt like it started off strong but then kind of went nowhere. I think he often talks about how he's not a big fan of romanticizing, of kind of turning it into this like romantic kind of story. He's just not a big fan of that direction for this character, for this story. Yeah, I mean, I think his vision is coming pretty singularly from just inside of himself and from Murnau's film,
and I think that's very clear about
Yeah.
that comment about the romance, in the fact that there is no, Lucy through the whole movie is arguably the strongest character.
Yeah.
Like she does not,
I agree.
bend her will to anything. Like she's like smart and she gets, of course
And
she's the one that
especially
winds up killing him.
Well, and especially if you put her character in, if you put her character as a woman in the mid 1800s, if you put it in that context, absolutely. Because you just, I think that in a lot of other tellings of this type of story, you would not have this be the case.
No.
And so I think you're right. It's even almost, Jonathan almost doesn't even have his own agency in a sense. Renfield definitely doesn't have his own agency.
Yeah.
He's immediately under the spell of Count Dracula, and eventually it just turns into an insane underling, if you will, I guess, of Dracula's, right? I mean, he's literally just mindless at that point.
Yeah.
Jonathan is so taken by this idea that he is going to make money off this. And then as soon as he goes to the castle, now everything he's doing is in reaction. And ultimately, I mean, he's ended up under Dracula's spell, literally as he's bitten, and he loses his agency. So even though Lucy dies in the end, I mean, she is the one who actually stops Dracula. And she's the only one who has any sense when the plague has taken over the city. People are dying. She says, I know who's to blame. I know what's behind this.
She goes to Van Helsing, yeah.
Of course, no one will listen to her. Van Helsing won't listen to her. But she is. I think she is the strongest character out of all of them here.
And I think it's interesting, too, that in Dracula, the Count Dracula movies, that we've got this very different kind of telling of the story, and it's been a few years since I've seen it, so I may get some of the details wrong, but from what I remember, is the character of Harker, who is named something different, I believe, in Dracula. But it might be the same, but he arrives at the castle and almost becomes Dracula's underling after he's been eaten or being blood sucked, and so he returns to London with Dracula, whereas in this one, characters have a little bit more autonomy. Of course, Harker, breaks out of the castle to get home to warn Lucy and to warn the town that this evil monster is coming.
Right. Sadly, once he gets there, he doesn't recognize her, and of course, eventually becomes replaces Kinski's Dracula. And but I agree, very interesting. Herzog even speak to that a little bit in one of the commentaries that I listened to, and it's interesting if you're interested to listen to those commentaries out there. I'll just make a quick note that the Shout Factory release of the Blu-ray, at least, I don't have the DVD, but at least the Blu-ray has both, and we're going to talk about this in a quick second too, has both the German and English versions of this film. We haven't spoken to that, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But on the German version, there are actually 2 commentary tracks from Herzog, and he actually speaks to that. The interviewer in one of the commentary tracks kind of makes note that Herzog didn't have a lot of female main characters, women, prior to this film. And, I guess Herzog kind of says to that his films are such, I guess his lead characters are such extensions of him that they kind of end up being males because he feels like they're just him, basically. Like he's just I mean, not literally, right? But he's transplanting parts of himself into these characters. So it is an important milestone, or an important thing to note, that there's something quite different for Herzog that he's doing here with her.
Yeah. And actually, I just looked this up, that it actually is Renfield in the Dracula movies that goes. So Harker's not a character. It's just Renfield who goes on his own and so becomes his underling. Yeah.
Mix up some characters. You can see where they get that. But
but I do want to also talk a little bit about, so what actually is kind of, and this is probably just coincidence, but it's funny that, as you mentioned, that there's a German and English version of Herzog's.
Right.
But in 1931, when they were doing the Bela Lugosi Dracula, there were actually 2 Draculas being consecutively shot there too.
Oh,
There was an Italian version that would shoot nights, and then during the day, the set would be used for the English version. So it's kind of funny that
a
again,
little
just
bit of
coincidence. I highly doubt
coincidence
that.
happens. Well,
Um,
and it is really interesting here that Herzog kind of in a way made two films at once, which is pretty amazing, and especially for the budget with which he made it. I mean, you got to keep in mind, very low budget for this film. But he shot both an English and German version. And there's a couple different explanations we get for that. On the one hand, we hear that 21st Century, who distributed it in the U.S., pushed him to make an English version. Herzog talks about the fact that they had an international cast, and English was the most commonly spoken language out of the entire cast, actually, as opposed to German. And we even do have some dubbing in there. Renfeld.
Renfeld's dubbed. Yeah.
Roland Topor, actually, I think, is dubbed, unfortunately, in both versions because they just deemed that his accent was too difficult to understand. But I think that
he's French in
correct.
So,
and a lot of these actors have some interesting. We not talk too much about that, but. I mean, obviously, Kinski, it kind of goes without saying that, Kinski's work with Herzog prior to this, talk about dynamic duo. Whenever you talk about Herzog, you can hardly refrain from mentioning Kinski, But Bruno Ganz was a very successful theater.
Yeah.
I think mostly by this time theater. But then, of course, he went on to have a long career, and you mentioned that he was even played Hitler in Downfall,
and which is arguably a lot of people consider that to be like the best depiction of Hitler as an actor.
He'll live on in the millions of memes that have been made from that scene where people redub that. But unfortunately, he passed away just last year or 2 years ago.
So
I think
2019, and his last role is actually Malick's film. A Hidden Life, which I thought was great. I don't know if you've seen that, but
I haven't seen it.
His final role is in that movie, and he's wonderful in that.
Yeah.
But it's a very small role, but still good.
Yeah.
But no, I do, and so I watched both versions. I watched the English and then the German. I'd seen the German before a few years ago, but I decided to rewatch them both.
Right.
But it's interesting because Herzog also refers to the German version as like more authentic,
definitely,
but that he doesn't disavow the English. He sort of says that they're both kind of watch which one you want, but I think the German one is the purest, more pure one.
Yeah.
But what I've noticed is that there's not a huge difference between the two of them. That there's no plot differences.
Yeah.
The most major difference is that the dialogue in English is stripped down. It's a lot more straightforward and less poetic.
Yeah.
And it's
interesting.
kind of, which is, and so it's just, and perhaps it's just, a matter of translation, but yeah, there's a lot more, just kind of straightforward dialogue.
And you said that Kinski's performance was a little less,
Kinski's
how should you say it, intense maybe.
Yes, it's a bit more subdued.
Yeah.
He kind of plays it back a little bit more, as opposed to in the German version, he's much more harsh and like sharp, which I thought was interesting. And it's not, I mean, again, I say much more, it's not something that you would go like, wow, this
you'd
is
have to watch it right. It's not like
but,
you'd leave the viewing with a impression of a completely different film. But if you watch them back to back, these things might become apparent. Yeah.
And it's I guess the kind of the other difference to me is just that scenes are slightly edited differently, which you and I kind of just put up to performances, like the likelihood that just performances worked in certain areas, and so
because everything is pretty much the setups are the same, the framing is the same. We have some instances where he'll cut to a close up where they stays in a wide, but it happens infrequently, and there's not a big difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say that I prefer the German one,
right?
But
I do too. But that's because
the German one to me, and the same reason that I think Herzog prefers it, and not to put words in his mouth, but I would assume that he prefers it because it is the the first language of the actors for most of the actors, and it's Herzog's first language. So naturally, you would feel an affinity towards the more authentic performances. Whereas if I was an actor, even if I spoke that second language completely fluently, I would still probably feel more comfortable to give my best performance in my native tongue.
Yeah.
So perhaps that's, he could have a completely different take on that. I'm
Sure.
not trying to
It could even
assume,
be
but
something as simple as, I mean, maybe they did, maybe they shot the German for some, like, takes 1 through 4 were German,
yeah,
and he feels like he's got it in the can, so they keep the same setup and then they move on. Now takes 5 through 10 are English, and it could
yeah,
just be something
yeah.
as simple as an order was different, and who knows, maybe vice versa. Maybe they weren't warmed up until the German version, or so who knows. I mean, unless you were there on set, there's no way to know. It'd
No.
be fun. It'd be fun if we ever get a chance to talk to Herzog about that. That would be a cool thing to discuss.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's in this past hour, I feel like we have gotten to touch on pretty much just about everything we
It
could
flew
touch
by
on.
too.
It flew by too.
Yeah.
Well, it's a beautiful film, and everybody out there listening, hopefully you have seen the film.
Hmm.
I don't really feel like there's been, I mean, I guess it's, how old is the film? 79?
79. Well,
Probably
I mean,
don't need
technically
to
the
put
story is 22, so
right, so
almost
it's
100
like
years old.
it's like I don't think we need to put spoiler alert anywhere,
No,
but
no.
hopefully you've seen the film prior to listening to this. But if you haven't, or heck, even if you have, hopefully our discussion here has inspired you to watch it again.
Yeah, and
If
I'd
you
watch the 22 version as well if you haven't seen it.
and look, I have been kind of modernized, I guess, for lack of a better term, as an audience member as much as the next person, right? We're a long ways away technologically from 1922 when it comes to filmmaking technology. And so, sometimes I think a lot of people might be resistant to watching silent films, or even Herzog's film from 79. A lot of younger people might be extremely hesitant because they're not cut the same. They're not, the timing is different, pacing is different. There's different ways that we tell story. I think film grammar has changed a little bit. Still the same building blocks, but we've changed a little bit of the how we use that grammar. And so I think sometimes there might be a resistance. Oh, this is boring, or especially it's subtitled, and especially if it's silent. But I really do feel like both of these films hold up. I think that if you even have a passing interest in film history, or in horror, you don't have to be a Herzog fan. You don't have to be a German expressionism fan. They're really interesting films. And let me say one thing real quick here, because we have, I don't think we try to go too deep into just specific little scenes. We try to kind of take a film on its whole and kind of talk about these things. But gosh, I want to see if you remember one of the scenes, because it really stood out to me and it was fun. And thinking now about how film technology has changed made me think of this. So in Murnau's film, there is this amazing scene where, so when Jonathan is locked in the castle, right? And Count Dracula loads up his coffins full of the earth and the rats that he's going to take on the river to beat Jonathan to Lucy. When he's loading it up, there's this, so in Herzog's film, it's very simple. We've got this kind of canted overhead shot, a very beautiful shot, but he's loading up this large kind of platform that's attached to his horses, and he puts the last coffin on top of this big stack of like a dozen black coffins, and kind of he climbs into it and closes it up from within, and then the horses take off driverless. So it's a pretty cool shot. But in Murnau's film, I feel like it's even better. It's so fun to see these little tricks from these old films. So we have kind of the same thing. There's this, these stacked up coffins on this carriage trailer, I guess. I don't know, did they still call them trailers back then?
Carriage, whatever, yeah.
Something, but this large flat platform that you'd use to haul cargo. And he gets in the coffin, but they use this beautiful stop motion photography to have the lid supernaturally placed upon the coffin to seal him up. And I just always think, I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, I remember the shot, yeah.
And I always just think how exciting those things must have been for an audience of that era. And, sometimes I feel like maybe there's a little hesitancy or resistance for people watching older films because we've kind of gotten, I don't know if cynical is the word, but we live in a day and age of CGI everything and, explosions everywhere and Marvel movies and spectacle. But to see such a simple technique performed in such an awesome, effective way, to me, it often beats all that CGI. It just the ingenuity and the simpleness, but it's how it's applied to the story, how effective it is. So I don't know. I highly recommend it. That's pretty much the only gist of all of that, is that I think they still hold up and they're still worth watching, and you should if you aren't. How's that?
Yeah.
I feel like I'm preaching now.
That's a good
one out there.
Yeah.
I need to say an amen. But But anyway, yeah, well, Kate Colin, as always, man. I mean, the time's flown by. Everybody listening out there, I hope you've enjoyed it as well. I know I have. Colin, it seems like you have. You talked about how fast you felt it flew by. So, well, I look forward to our next episode where we will likely cover another Herzog film, which we have yet to pick out. So if anybody out there listening has any suggestions, what films that you'd like us to discuss, please, by all means, shoot us an email. But yeah, Colin, until next time, and everybody out there listening, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.